Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Monk. So this is your opportunity to ask all the questions you've had lingering in your minds about the Buddha and his teachings and his disciples and anything remotely, vaguely related to Buddhist practice or Buddhist customs or Buddhist culture or Buddhist fashion or Buddhist hairstyles or whatever it is on your mind. You can go ahead and ask, and we'll answer as best we can. So the fun starts as soon as the questions start appearing in the live chat. And so far, there are no questions in the live chat. Here we go.
But first of all, hello to AP and to Bobby and the account and to some other friends who haven't checked in yet, but we can see you as a little number on the screen. And we have the first question. Oh, Jessica, good to see you. Welcome. Hope your health is doing all right these days.
Okay, so AP asks, how do monks and nuns go on alms round in the States as opposed to other countries, for example, Thailand or other Asian countries? Well, first off, Ayasoma is crusading for the elimination of the word nun in Buddhism, and instead has been promoting the use of the word female monk, or even just monk. There she goes, even just monk. And she has very good etymological and cultural reasons for this. So here at Empty Cloud Monastery, we use the word monk as a gender-neutral term inclusive of both male and female and gender non-binary folks. As for your question, one of the biggest differences is that in the West, most people are not familiar with alms round. And if they just see somebody walking around with a bowl, they don't necessarily understand what that is. So in Thailand and Sri Lanka and Burma, usually the monks will just take their bowl and walk, and lay people will see the monk coming and they'll bring out food to offer to the monk. In the West, normally it only works that way if there are people who know that you're coming, who know that you have a prescribed route that you walk, and they'll meet you there. In the West, if you're not following a predetermined route which people already know about, commonly the practice is to stand rather than to walk. So a monk will go outside a grocery store or go to a farmer's market or a convenience store or something of that sort, and they'll just stand there with their bowl until eventually somebody comes up and asks them what they're doing and what they're all about. And at that time, then the monk will explain, I am a Buddhist monk. I'm doing our religious practice of collecting food for my meal and so on. And 9 times out of 10, the person will say, well, good luck, and walk away. And 1 time out of 10, then they'll ask what they can offer. And they might give you something to eat. So that's the main difference, is that in the West, there tends to be more standing rather than walking. But otherwise, it's actually not dramatically different, except, of course, for the fact that in Buddhist countries, a lot more people will want to offer food. Those are my main thoughts. Do you have anything else, Aya?
Yeah, I would say it's the first time I went to alms rounds actually was in the States, and the only time I actually went on alms rounds outside of the States has been in Thailand. And they were 2 radically different experiences, but both incredibly enriching. So beautiful to be actually the recipient of generosity from strangers, and so humbling. But yeah, as Bante mentioned, normally what we did in California when I went on alms rounds was to, the first time that I went on alms rounds, what we normally do was to stand for a period of time in front of a grocery store, and it was kind of interesting to see how people were very curious, and they tried to offer money, because that's normally what people are looking for when they're standing with a sort of bowl in front of a grocery store. So someone came to give money, and we explained how we weren't accepting money, but we were accepting food offerings if those were offered. And it was really, I still remember, made a huge impression on my mind, the reaction of the person who was actually shocked that we were not looking for money. And after the shock, actually this sort of bright smile appeared on his face, and he rushed inside the grocery store, purchased a bunch of different things, and came to offer them to us, and actually thanked us for making his day. And he had no idea what Buddhism was, and not really any idea of what the practice was, but it was the mess. Like, he kind of like understood straight away the practice of generosity and delighted in the practice of generosity, which is why the Buddha created this beautiful, codependent relationship between monastics and lay people. And so you'll see the same thing happening in Asia, but in a different way, where people are already know that it's something that, first of all, that giving, so letting go, so the practice of renunciation, basically, that lay people do over and over again, which is offering something to the monastics, brings in incredible joy and incredible merit. So actually, it was Bump and I were around, went on alms rounds one morning with another monk, and as we were walking in the street, this scooter, this couple in a scooter, like, drove by, and then as soon as they see us, they like go back, and then they reappear after like a couple of minutes, and they had rushed to go to the store to buy some food, because as soon as they saw us, they thought, this is such a great opportunity to make merit. It's a great opportunity to delight the mind by renunciation. So it's really, as I have to say, as a monastic, being the recipient of such generosity is such a big blessing and teaching. Seeing how something so powerful, because it's obviously not because they're giving it to Ayasoma or to Bante Sudazo, but rather to who we represent, and bring so much joy and happiness to everyone involved, and to see how, even though the cultures are different, human nature is always the same, and we all delight in giving, and we all delight in letting go.
Okay, and hello to a few more friends checking in. Hello, Adriana, Spiral Spirit. I don't know Spiral Spirit's name. Do you know?
I don't, but okay. I kind of like Spiral Spirit.
It's actually pretty good. Maybe we could all just go by our internet pseudonyms.
Well,
I mean, my internet pseudonym is Bante Sudaso, so maybe that wouldn't work so well for me. Hello, Gita, Nyana, Melinda, Mark, Bobby. Great, welcome. So Bobby's asking, how can we deal with parents who are not accepting of wanting to pursue monasticism? Well, I think you've asked the right people, because both of us have had this experience. Would you want to go first?
Well, it's a great opportunity to practice patience and loving kindness and love without attachment, actually. So, it's very easy to love parents that are very supportive and are happy about the decisions that we make. It's a little bit more challenging, both for the parents, actually, to be quite frank, and I sometimes put myself in the sort of shoes of my parents, and I'm kind of like, well, if I were, scientific materialist / atheist, the last thing I would want in life is to have a religious child that goes even beyond being religious, actually ordains and decides to renounce pretty much anything that I've worked, my entire life for, sort of created kind of certain conditions for them to enjoy, and they're like, thanks, but no thanks. So I have to say that it's been a work in progress, but more than changing my parents' mind has been more kind of changing my mind towards my parents. And not in terms of changing my decisions. Obviously, clearly, I'm in robes. And I'm quite happy to be a monastic. But rather shifting my expectations towards my parents and actually practicing what I preach. So instead of sort of trying to push my agenda and try to make them understand or accept what I'm doing in a rational way, which basically was my strategy, unsuccessful strategy for the first 2 or 3 years. I just let go of being right and just started practicing kindness and being there, being supportive, stop, as I say, playing ping pong like my parents like to, kind of say harsh things to me. And then we have this pattern where they sort of say something harsh and then I say something harsh back and then they say something harsh. So we're like playing ping pong. So at the very beginning, I was like, oh, my parents are so evil. They say all these like unpleasant things about my choices. And they were having the same actually story. And as my practice went by, then I realized that actually there was a bit of a bigger, fuller picture of the story. And I was actually an active participant to begin with. So I stopped playing ping pong. And because there was, you have to be two in order to play ping pong. And they slowly kind of got tired of throwing the ball at me. And that started creating the grounds for a kind of healthier and more wholesome relationship to come into being. And for them to then start accepting or becoming a little bit more comfortable. Accepting might be still a big word, but rather becoming less hostile and more okay, perhaps slightly more, more equanimous maybe to my life and to my choices, because they see that I'm becoming a better person, because they see I'm becoming more patient, more kind. So they're like, I don't know what this is, what this thing is. It still seems like a pretty bizarre idea and quite weird choice, but whatever it is, it seems to be working for the better. So that's long story long. Okay. How to deal. How about you, Bumpin?
Well, first off, I'll share a quote from my preceptor. He said, you don't win your family over using logic, you win them over using kindness. So similar to what Ayasoma was saying. So you're not necessarily going to convince your parents through arguments, trying to convince them that Buddhism is correct and monasticism is the best thing for you, but rather just by demonstrating the fruits of your practice by being kind and gentle and tolerant and loving and supportive of them. But also don't back down. If you want to be a monk, well, then start spending time at monasteries. Just start setting up your life to go and be a monk. Your parents can't stop you. So just do it. And in the meantime, practice sila, samadhi, and panya. Practice morality, mental unification, and wisdom. And be as kind and gentle and loving towards your parents as you can at all times. So in my case, so for me, my parents were both very fundamentalist Christians. very strong fundamentalist evangelical Christians. So similarly, to have their son not only renounce Christianity, but commit to another religion and in fact become ordained in another religion was mind-blowing to them. It was kind of like, why did he intentionally sign up for hell? He was on the path to heaven, and instead he signed on to the path to hell. That's really weird, really sad, really disturbing. So they were pretty unhappy about it for years. And unfortunately, my father passed away many years ago, so I don't know if he would have changed his attitude eventually. But my mom did. So a few years back, I was talking to my mom, and she actually said that even though she didn't agree with it at first because of religious reasons, she can't deny that it's made me much happier, much kinder, much wiser, much more stable. So she's come to accept it over the years because she's seen how beneficial it is. So my mom's actually quite accepting of me being a monk, but it took a few years. It didn't happen overnight. It takes a little while. So yeah, if you want to be a monk, just be a monk. And eventually your parents will get over it. Be kind to them. Be gentle. Give them time. Eventually they'll come around. Okay.
All right. And Gita is asking, Bankanaya, how do you manage in the winter since it's far too cold to go on alms rounds? Well, there is a kitchen in the monastery where we live. So that's normally used, and that's where the meals are prepared. Or sometimes there are some really kind people that come to the monastery and offer dana.
We also usually have a couple of lay residents who are here to help out with all the things that we need help with.
Yeah.
So if you want to come, Gita, if you want to come and stay with us for a couple weeks and help out with everything, you're certainly more than welcome to.
And Mark is saying, so in Buddhism, is karma always tit for tat? Meaning if I steal, I get stolen from? Or could it be I steal, so later I see the error of this, and let's say help the poor or counsel people in prison? Want to answer that?
Yeah, so the Buddha does, well, first off, the Buddha says that the full workings of karma are extremely complex and that it's impossible for an unenlightened being to have a full understanding of karma. So the descriptions that the Buddha does give of the workings of karma are, they are put in a pretty clear one-to-one format, but not quite in the way that you're describing of if I steal, I get stolen from. Instead, what he says is if you are stingy, then you will be poor. If you are generous, then you will be wealthy. If you are kind, then you will be beautiful. If you are cruel, then you will be ugly. If you help others, then you will be healthy. If you harm others, then you will be unhealthy. So those aren't exactly one-to-one. So he's not saying if you harm other people, then other people will harm you. But rather he's saying if you create the conditions for others to have physical health problems, then you in the future will have physical health problems. So it's this is also pointing to the fact that the way karmic consequences manifest is not always straightforwardly clear, because there's many other factors which influence how we feel the effects of karma. However, the effects are also clearly in some degree of correspondence with what we did. So taking the example of if you harm others, then you will have poor health. You can see the connection. If you are generous, then you will be wealthy. You can see the connection. So that's more what I would point to, is that the results of karma will always be in line with the actions, but not necessarily exactly the same. So one moment. She's telling me to keep going. As for your thing about if you steal and then later see the error of this and decide to help the poor or counsel people in prison, well, that would be choosing to stop creating bad karma and to start creating good karma instead. So of course, that's a good thing. It's highly recommended to make good karma rather than bad karma. But you will still experience the consequences of the bad karma of your previous stealing. But you will also experience the good karma of helping the poor and counseling people. The simile the Buddha gives is the simile of the lump of salt. And this is a simile I've mentioned many, many times, so you might have heard this before. So he says, if you take a lump of salt and you put it in a glass of water, then the water tastes salty. But if you take that same lump of salt and you put it in a huge lake, then even though the salt is there, it's diluted by so much water that you can barely taste it. So in the same way, if you do some evil deeds and very few good deeds, then the effect of your evil karma will be very strong, very noticeable. But if you've done some evil deeds, but then you do a huge amount of good deeds, then the effects of your evil deeds will be barely noticeable. It will be diluted by all the good karma.
Disclaimer, there was a sudden thunderstorm here, and I realized that there were some open windows in the other part of the monastery.
Okay. And next question, Bobby asks, is Buddhism the only way to enlightenment, or is it possible for people of other religions to become enlightened? Thoughts on Sufi mystics, Hindu sadhus, and Christian monks who seem to have high levels of spiritual attainments? So this is a question which is difficult to answer in a politically correct way. So briefly speaking, the critical component for attaining enlightenment is the view of not self and the relinquishment of all views of self. That's the critical component. And this is the unique aspect of Buddhism. So Sufism, Hinduism, and Catholicism have a lot of spiritual practices which are great at cultivating sila and samadhi and a certain degree of panya. But I am not aware of any religious or spiritual system other than Buddhism which teaches a system for abandoning the belief in self-existence and to developing a direct understanding of not self. So I would say that if somebody is a member of another religion and they are studying the Buddha's teachings and cultivating the perception of not self, then they might attain enlightenment. But if somebody is not cultivating the perception of not self and they have a belief in self-existence, then they may develop many wonderful spiritual qualities and reach quite a high level of spiritual attainment, but they will not attain enlightenment, at least not in this life. So it is the critical piece. The critical piece is not self, anatta. It's the critical piece that's missing from other spiritual systems.
This being said, though, at least in the Catholic tradition, not that I have personal experience of, but some other monastics who have spent, Buddhist monastics actually, who have spent time in Catholic monasteries, not all Catholic monastic traditions, but some of them, they were telling me how the way in which they practice Christianity is radically different than the kind of Christianity that is sort of taught to the masses. So I was born and bred in Italy, so there's a kind of like very sort of straightforward. Wow, you heard that was like
So there's some thunder nearby, apparently.
Yeah, devas are excited tonight. But yeah, so anyway, in those spiritual traditions, apparently the way that they talk about Christianity and also how they talk about God and about a lot of different sort of about the soul, like a lot of different kind of things. Ayamindanandi was actually telling me that if one starts not paying attention to the terminology that is used, the boundaries become very, very subtle. But there is one really interesting thing about the Buddhist teachings is that they are easily understandable. You have a really clear idea of what to practice, what to do, as opposed to the majority of like the traditions within Catholicism. For example, when I went to Franciscan monastery, their practice is really beautiful, but when you try to read the scriptures, very confusing, very cryptic. It also has some historical reasons that the Vatican also censored historically, not now, not currently, but like 1,000 years ago, 800 years ago. Actually, for most of its probably lifespan. So whenever there were some mystic practices, the practitioners couldn't really talk about it openly, but they had to be cryptic on purpose, which then makes it even more difficult to kind of truly understand it. So I did a tiny bit of research in that, and that's actually the result was that I had even more passion and gratitude for the Dhamma because it's so simple and easy to understand, and you can automatically, like, immediately see results. But yeah, I think it was like worth mentioning just because sometimes also neither, like both Bhante and I are pretty monogamous in terms of spirituality, so we're both very much into Buddhism, but we haven't really explored other spiritual traditions, but there's definitely other monastics that have, in fact, and they have perhaps a different viewpoint.
Yeah, so just as an example, many years ago I met a very old Benedictine monk. He's in his 90s these days, I forget exactly how old, named Brother David Steindl-Rast. And when he would talk about God, I was right on board. Like the way he talked about God lined up very closely with the Mahayana concept of Dharmakaya Buddha. So it was something which didn't seem to contradict Buddhist theory at all. So similarly to what Ayasoma was saying, within the contemplative and mystical branches of Christianity, there are some practices and teachings which seem to get quite close to Buddhist territory. So next question, Bobby says, isn't it a rule that you can't ordain without the consent of your parents? So that is a rule. However, it is not a mandatory rule in the sense that it doesn't invalidate your ordination. So it's more of a recommendation rather than a hard rule. So there are hard rules, like you must be at least 20 years old. If you're not 20 years old, then you cannot be ordained. You must be a human being. If you're not a human being, you cannot get ordained. There's a few other mandatory requirements for an ordination. But then there's a number of other conditions which are not mandatory requirements, but they're more like recommendations. And one of them is getting permission from your parents. So the truth is that a lot of monks get ordained without permission from their parents, especially convert Buddhists. Permission from the parents is often not coming. So that's usually waived. In the case of convert Buddhists, it's usually not required. So for example, I I actually did get permission from my mom before my bhikkhu ordination. But when I asked her for permission, what she told me was, she was like, look, son, you're going to do it even if I say no. And I was like, yeah. And she's like, well, then fine, you can have permission. So she also knew what was going on. She knew it wasn't going to stop me anyway, that it was just a formality that I was doing. But in other cases, monks either get ordained without their parents even knowing. So my preceptor, for example, was a monk for 7 years before his mom found out. 7 years.
His mother clearly was not Italian.
Yeah, Canadian. So he was living in Thailand. He became a monk. And so a couple times a year, he would write these short letters to his mom, which are like, dear mom, it's the mango season. There's lots of mangoes. They're really good. Okay, bye. I'm not kidding. He actually told us that this is what his letters to his mom were like. And then finally, after 7 years, he was like, oh, by the way, I'm a Buddhist monk. Apparently, it's a little bit different in Italian culture.
Yes. First of all, there's no way that you can not see your parents for 7 years. That's pretty much fact. All right. And Kostya says, and Corey say, where can I find out more about the etymology of females being called monks? Also, what monastery are you at? Is it possible to make a retreat there or even ordain? Okay, so one at a time.
Yeah, one question at a time.
So the etymology, well, actually, it's a fun fact, but in pretty much, so in Italian, for example, monk is monaco, and the female is monaca. And in Spanish, monje and monja, or something like that. And then it's a peculiarity, basically, for of English to have monk and nun. And by the way, this particular name is relative to the to the Christian tradition, as opposed to the term monk being, yes, relative to the Christian tradition, but actually used fundamentally for pretty much spiritual practitioners across the boards. So nun comes from nonnus, which was, if you're familiar with Thai Buddhism, it's kind of like the equivalent of sort of Wangpo. So back in the day, nonnus was an appellative given to older people who were venerated, which then, in fact, in Italian stayed as became what we call our grandparents. So my grandparents would be nonno and nonna. And in English, it started becoming a little bit of a sort of term for several different historical reasons. Then it was kept for women and given to, and not for males. So you have this kind of peculiar distinction between the male order and the female order, which actually is not the case in every other tradition. There is, though, an analogy, which is what I believe is why it's a female monastic is called nun rather than monk or monkette or whatever you want to, monkress.
Monkette is pretty good.
And it's probably because in the Christian tradition, like in pretty much any spiritual tradition except for Buddhism, at the very beginning, the females weren't allowed to ordain by the institution. Hence, they started organizing by themselves and started practicing as monastics. And so in Italian, for example, you have two different terms that now have become kind of synonyms, but in reality have two different distinctions. So one is monaca, which is monk, and the other one is suora, which is the synonym of sorella, sister. And at the very beginning, every female monastic who was a sister, and they weren't officially ordained, they were just practicing like their male monks. And then once they actually got official ordination, they were allowed to have official ordination, then they became a monaca. So I thought, that's kind of peculiar that we're copying and pasting a sort of tradition from Christianity and copying it in Buddhism. I think we have enough like issues with misogyny in our own tradition to copy the ones from Christianity. And it's because that's the same. I think, I believe, I suspect in the UK. Sorry, in English, being nonnos, being nonna, like kind of old auntie or old grandmother rather than actually monastic. And also the term monk really so it comes from monos, from the Greek monos, which means alone, solitary, and that's what basically we're all practicing. It is a practice of renunciation and of solitude. So it makes so much more sense than to actually borrow, once again, words from different traditions. And actually, it's only in the Western world that nun, the word nun, is used for female practitioners. When you actually see English-speaking papers from Asia, they actually use monk as a gender neutral term. So when you read the Bangkok Times, they will talk about Venerable Dhammananda Bhikkhuni as a monk. They will specify female just simply because these days there's still some discrimination in Buddhism in terms of ordained female monastics. So often they will specify female, just the gender. But monk is what is used. And you'll see also in Pali, it's bhikkhu and bhikkhuni. It's not bhikkhu and jinitto, it's like the same root of the word. So I feel it's important to, kind of keep the spirit of it. Otherwise, you can use other, it could be called Rabbi Soma or Imam Soma. It's just as accurate as nun Soma.
And we could come up with a new term for that matter.
Yeah, or a new term. Yeah. But it's just very arbitrary. So I'm not particularly a fan of nun. Also because then it sounds to me like grandmother, because nonna. And I'm like, I don't really want to be a grandmother,
Well, it's actually quite reminiscent of how in Buddhist cultures, the words that they invented to refer to women who were not bhikkhunis, like women who were living a semi-monastic life but who were not fully ordained. So, for example, in the Tibetan tradition, they would call women who are not fully ordained, they'd call them ani or anila, which means aunt. And in Thailand, they use the term mechi, which means mother. In Sri Lanka, they used dasasila mata, which means a mother who follows 10 precepts. In Burma, what's the word they use in Burma? I'm blanking.
Sayale. Well, that actually means
little teacher.
Little teacher.
Little teacher.
That's what I think.
As opposed to sayadaw, big teacher. So there also, again, is this pejorative, like mildly insulting term. But yeah, like noticing how this tendency to, rather than refer to them as a bhikkhuni, which again just means female bhikkhu, instead, because they're not bhikkhunis, referring to them using a word like auntie or mommy or little teacher, not as good as the big teachers, of course. So using the word nun in English does carry a similar flavor. So
we're not fans.
I actually, before Ayasoma pointed out the etymology, I'd never thought about this, but then she pointed it out and I'm like, wow, she has a really good point here.
And what monastery are you at? We're at Empty Cloud Monastery in West Orange, New Jersey, in the United States.
Which we started together a few months ago.
It's a dual gender monastery, obviously. And is it possible to make a retreat there? Normally, when it's not a pandemic, yes, that's normally we have lots of retreats here. And even ordain, well, one step at a time. First, you can come and practice with us, then kind of, yeah, see it, take it step by step.
Okay. And Larissa asks, does emptiness contradict the concept of self-compassion in general? Is practicing self-compassion not useful? So the answer is no, emptiness does not contradict the concept of self-compassion. So the reason why self-compassion is brought forward is because people often forget about themselves when they do compassion practice. So thinking, may everyone except me be happy. Well, that's just another form of self-centeredness, isn't it? So true selflessness is, may everyone, including myself, be happy. If you either say, may only me be happy, or may everyone except me be happy, either way, it's just another form of self-centeredness. So true compassion is limitless and all-inclusive. So the focus on self-compassion is particularly for people who tend to diminish themselves, to leave themselves out, to not be kind to themselves, to not be compassionate for themselves. Because to lack compassion towards any sentient being is a stain on one's practice that prevents enlightenment. Thoughts?
Yeah, I think that's covered it. Great. We look forward to seeing you, Gita. Sadhu.
Yeah.
And Mark is asking, any recommended suttas on karma?
Well, the Chula Kama Vibhanga Sutta is a classic. It's the one I was referring to earlier. There's also the Mahakama Vibhanga Sutta, but that one's a little. You can read it, but you'll see it's not quite as useful as the Chula Kama Vibhanga for this. But actually, realistically, just read the suttas. The Buddha talks about karma all over the place.
Well, so what does the Buddha say on when karma manifests? This lifetime, 2 lifetimes, are there any rules that he spoke of? So what the Buddha said is that if you start obsessing too much about karma, that your head is going to explode. So that's very important to keep it in mind. So what I find very useful is rather than obsessing about like, okay, so like it's going to come in thank you, very kind, Sam. Rather than obsessing about the hows and whys, it's just understanding causality, that every action has a consequence. Intentional action has a consequence. And really looking at it, you don't have to wait for your next life or 2 lives or 3 lives. You can see both immediately, actually, consequences. In your mind, for example, whenever you do something unwholesome, if you're really looking at your mind, really investigating your mind, if you're cultivating mindfulness, you'll see that whenever you make an intentional unwholesome choice, there will be an unwholesome result immediately. Can be as simple as, for example, restlessness, guilt, sense of guilt, unhappiness, anxiety. It was incredible. We had this talk on anxiety. We always have talks on anxiety, but like the first talk of anxiety, or second talk on anxiety that we did at the beginning of Buddhist Insights was given by this lovely monk from India, actually. I don't remember his name. Do you remember his name?
No, I don't.
Anyway, he was great. He came and pretty much the entire talk was how to solve anxiety, become a good person.
Yeah, he was focusing on morality. So his point was actually that if you have strong morality and strong generosity, then you won't have anxiety in the first place. So that was very interesting. He didn't actually talk about how to remove anxiety. He spoke about how to prevent it from arising in the first place.
Exactly. Yeah. And then you see that a lot of times what we focus on the effect rather than on the cause. And so whenever there is, that's where you start seeing causality, the huge impacts on the mind. And that's when it becomes something that is practical, concrete, and just understanding. It doesn't really matter what you did in the past. What is important is not to do unwholesome things right now. It's what you're doing here in this moment. Are you purifying the mind? Are you making wholesome actions, or are you not? And whatever we've done, realistically, we've been around and about for so long that we've been both Hitler and Mother Teresa. So the things that are going to appear, like the things that are going to come into being, are going to be both extremely wholesome and extremely unwholesome. So it's really about building a mind that is strong and rooted in the Dhamma, so we can bear with whatever condition that arises, that comes into being based on unwholesome past choices, and experience more and more wholesome, make more wholesome choices and experience better conditions that lead to awakening, that lead towards Nibbana. Not that lead towards like accumulating a bunch of wealth and becoming a sort of how do you say deva or whatever people have kind of aspirations, but rather what is it that brings towards awakening.
And just to directly answer your question, so one, I agree with everything Ayasoma said. But two, the Buddha does say that karma sometimes manifests immediately, sometimes later in this life, sometimes in the next life, and sometimes in a distant future life. So, and actually there's one sutta where the Buddha states that karma sometimes doesn't manifest for eons. So sometimes when we get this sudden spike of bad luck appearing, it's because of something we did hundreds of thousands of lifetimes ago that only now, for whatever reason, is manifesting. And also I would add to that also karma can manifest in more than one of these. You might get an immediate result and then also some delayed consequence later on in this life or in future lives.
And Larissa says, also, I didn't add earlier, why do you use phrases of may I in metta meditation, considering non-self? I'll reply with a quote from Bhante Ji, who said a few years ago, he said, when I was on retreat with him, he said this thing that really got stuck in my mind. He was like, well, everybody talks about Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, but have we ever met Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday? So why do we speak about Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday? Convention. It's easier to communicate with others. Makes life a little bit easier to navigate, to explain, what we're talking about. So in the same way, we talk about this being and this other being, I, him, her, they. Otherwise, it would be extremely complicated. So this set of aggregates subject to clinging would like to communicate with that other. Like it's just like really complicated. Can't even do it.
I would just add to that, though, that if a phrase that you're using in meditation is not working for you, then do something else. So if you find starting a phrase with may I just feels wrong to you, well, then use different phrasing. So when I do metta meditation, I never use any phrases that start with may I. But that's me. I like may everyone be happy, for example. It's very clear and simple. Nobody's left out. But some people, they actually find the phrase, may I be happy. They find that incredibly powerful. So try things out and see what happens. If may I be happy doesn't feel right to you, well, then try out some other things. So may everyone without exception be happy. May everyone, including myself, be happy. May everyone be happy. As long as it's clear to you that that includes all beings, including this one, then you'll be fine. AP says, I think if your parents are sick and you have to take care of them, then you cannot become a monk. That's actually not true. So as I mentioned earlier, you can still become a monk, but in that case, you would need to ask yourself whether or not it was the proper decision. So that would not prevent you from becoming a monk, according to the Vinaya rules, but it is a moral consideration which you would need to really carefully weigh. And Mark is telling a success story of non-violently dispelling ants from his house using peppermint oil. So congratulations, Mark. Happy to hear it. Yeah, it's totally possible to deal with all manner of so-called pests in a non-violent way. Yeah.
And AP asks, as Buddhists, what is the best way to spread the Dhamma? After all, we may not be Buddhist today if it wasn't for King Ashoka spreading Buddhism in Asia.
Well, the first thing I would say is, in order to spread Buddhism, you first have to practice Buddhism. And in order to practice Buddhism, you need to understand Buddhism. And in order to understand Buddhism, then you need to let go of whatever you think you already know. And open yourself to the possibility that the Buddhist teachings may be different from what you think they are. So start with an open mind, really carefully trying to understand and learn what the Buddha taught, and then with sincerity and diligence, live the Noble Eightfold Path in all its details and characteristics. And that actually will already start to transform the people around you. Then when the time is right and the situation is appropriate, then you can talk about the Dhamma, and you can talk about your practice, and you can talk about the benefits that it brings. And that's a wonderful way of spreading the Dhamma. Another way is to support organizations that are doing the work of practicing and sharing the Dhamma. So this is actually a very time-honored way of spreading the Dhamma, is you support the institutions that spread the Dhamma, support the monasteries, support the Buddhist organizations that are doing good work in the world. And it makes a difference. But remember that first and foremost, if you want to spread the Dharma, you have to live the Dharma. Okay?
And Mark says, coming from 30 years of a Hindu tradition, I'm learning a subtle difference in the use of common terms like karma. So thanks for all the info. Great. I'm happy. Wow, 30 years, it's a lot.
Yeah, this actually is a long-standing difficulty. So I come across this quite often. So people who started in Hinduism and then come to Buddhism often have a more difficult time than people who come from completely different religions and then come to Buddhism. And one of the reasons why is precisely this. It's because there's a lot of words which are the same word in both religions, but have rather different meanings. And that can be quite confusing. So yeah, once again, you basically have to learn all those words over again. You can't assume they mean the same thing as they did in Hinduism. So it can be quite difficult. It's actually easier if you're coming to Buddhism fresh, because then you hear the word karma and you're like, what does karma mean? And then you find out what it means in Buddhism, and that's it. It's harder if you already have a different definition and now you have to learn a new definition. But again, I'm happy that you're making the effort, because Buddhism's great. I like it a lot.
All right. And on that note, I think that's all for this evening. So thank you all for joining us this evening. And we'll meet you again next week from Wednesday to Friday, 8 a.m. Sutta Study and 7:30 p.m. Dhamma Talk. And Friday evening, there's always monk chat. So if you have other questions, you can bring them next Friday. All right.
So we'll end with 3 sadhus. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. And see you next time.
And have a great Interdependence